All were agreed as to the necessity of a change in the form of government and on the importance of effecting that change without delay. Convinced that a temporizing conduct could only be attended with danger, General Bonaparte put his hand immediately to the work and the Directory disappeared. The military men who had been principally distinguished by their career victories placed themselves at General Bonaparte's disposal. The director, Sieyès, brought over to his side the most influential men of both councils. Those, in short, who, wearied of the excesses of the revolution, felt the necessity of placing at the head of affairs a man of sufficient moderation to conciliate all parties, and of sufficient firmness to keep them within proper bounds. Bournonville, Macdonald, Lefebvre, and Moreau himself, all of who had embarked in the conspiracy, reckoned as their accomplices not only the generals and administrators of the army of Italy who were then in Paris, but also Chenier, Cavani, Roederer, Talleyrand, and others. It was a coalition between the flower of the army and the most select members of the philosophic party to accomplish the national wish. With the exception of Bernadotte, who at that time could only see the safety of the state in a republic, and the type of a true republican in Jacobinism, all the commanders of the army of Italy rounded round their general. Berthier, Eugène de Beauharnais, Duroc, Bessières, Marmont, Lannes, Lavalette, Murat, Lefebvre, Caffarelli, brother of the general who died in Syria, Merlin, son of the director, Bury, and Renan de Saint-Jean d'Angely, Arnaud of the Institute, the commissary Collot, all gave proofs of zeal and devotedness to the cause. All ranks, down to the 22 guides lately arrived from Egypt, were eager to promote it. Each one served General Bonaparte in his own way. Augereau himself, who inwardly detested him, after a short hesitation decided upon joining his ranks. He perhaps came to offer his services because it was not thought worth while to solicit them. Do you no longer reply upon your little Augereau? He said to General Bonaparte, when he saw in the Council of 500, of which he was a member, the Assembly proposed to outlaw General Bonaparte. He could not help saying, "We are in an awkward position. We shall get out of it," replied the general. "Dost thou forget our coal?" If Augereau's words indicated his fears, I will not allow myself to believe that those which escaped Bernadotte were the echo of his wishes. Meeting General Bonaparte at the moment when he was going to review his troops assembled in the Champs-Élysées, "Thou art on the road to the guillotine," he said to him, with his Gascon accent. "We shall see," dryly replied General Bonaparte. I shall rapidly run over the events of the 18th and 19th Brumaire and lay a stress upon those only of which I can speak with certainty, and merely advert to others when I can present details hitherto unknown, which my official situation enabled me to obtain at a later period. The Council of Ancients gave the first signal as agreed upon. Monsieur Lebrun, afterwards third consul, arch-treasurer, and Duke of Plasencia, made a report upon the deplorable condition of the Republic and the necessity of preventing its ruin by the application of immediate remedies. The council adopted his suggestions. It issued a decree which transferred the legislative body to St. Cloud in order that it might deliberate in a place beyond the influence of the capital. At the same time, it charged General Bonaparte with the execution of this measure and conferred upon him the command of all the troops in Paris and within its constitutional limits. This decree, sanctioned by the Council of 500, of which Lucien Bonaparte was the president, was immediately transmitted to General Bonaparte with an invitation to come and take the oath required by his new functions. The general was not slow in making his appearance. He mounted his horse, passed through Paris in the midst of a group of general officers who had assembled at his house in expectation of this event, and surrounded by this warlike escort, he presented himself at the bar of the council. Having taken the oath, he appointed General Lefebvre, who commanded the Directorial Guard, to be his lieutenant, and distributed the other appointments amongst the several generals who accompanied him. Lannes received the command of the guard of the legislative body. Murat was named to that of St. Cloud, and Moreau to the Luxembourg. 3 members of the Directory gave in their resignation. The magisterial body to which they belonged was dissolved by this act, the other 2 directors not forming the number requisite for deliberating upon state affairs. The events of the 18th Brumaire had prepared the revolution. It was ended by the event of the 19th, not, however, without some difficulty. The young heads of the Council of 500 and the old revolutionary ones of the Council of Ancients had had leisure to reflect upon what was going forward. The new order of things could not be favorable to the principles professed by either. They concerted the means of resisting it. The course it naturally presented itself to rally around the Constitution of the year 3. It was proposed by Ducem, one of their most spirited demagogues, that they should each be called upon by name to renew the oath to defend it. This motion was intended to cement the union of the conspirators by fresh bonds and afford time for the affiliated brethren of the suburbs of Paris to come to the assistance of their party at St. Cloud. The proposal was unanimously carried. General Bonaparte must necessarily lose the time which it was Ducem's object to gain. All that the former had done on the preceding day would be turned against him unless he came at once to the point. He presented himself before the Council of Ancients, invited it, in a speech full of energy, to take into consideration the turn of the public mind and the danger with which the country was threatened, and no longer to delay adopting some resolution. A member of the council, however, now called upon him to explain himself, to calm the prevailing spirit of uneasiness, and to deny his entertaining the projects ascribed to him, and swear to the Constitution. Does the Constitution still exist? Rejoined Bonaparte, enumerating then all the instances in which it had been violated by the councils when they prescribed the Directory, and by the Directory when they prescribed the councils. He added that 20 conspiracies were at work to substitute a new order of things to that Constitution, the inadequacy of which was proved by the facts which had occurred. The 20 different parties had urged him to place himself at their head, some with the view of recommencing the revolution, others of giving it a retrograde movement, that he had refused to serve any of them, feeling, as he did, but one interest out of preserving the good produced by the revolution. He was aware, he said, that some friends of foreign powers spoke of having him proscribed, but that the person who proposed his outlawry was, perhaps, not far from being placed in that dilemma, that relying on the justice of his cause and the purity of his motives, he trusted to the counsels, to his friends, and to his good fortune. He repaired to the Council of 500, there to make the same communications, but he no sooner appeared in the hall, at the door of which he had left the small military escort that accompanied him, when the cry was raised of "Down with the tyrant! Let the dictator be outlawed!" He had advanced towards the estrade, where the president, his brother Lucien, was seated. He was surrounded and assailed with threats. One deputy, more impetuous than his colleagues, went so far as to attempt to stab him. A grenadier of the guard of the legislative body named Tomé parried the blow with his arm. The soldier left at the door came to his rescue and forced the general away from the grasp of those madmen. He soon afterwards returned to release Lucien Bonaparte, whom these ungovernable men were endeavoring to compel to put to the vote a decree of proscription against his brother. General Bonaparte had left the hall to join the troops quartered in the courtyard of the castle, where many deputies had insinuated themselves for the purpose of detaching them from the cause of their chief. He arrived in the midst of the troops at the most critical moment. A few moments later, and all would have been lost, he resolved to accelerate the conclusion of the business, and addressing an officer of infantry, Captain Ponsard of the Grenadiers, the legislative body, who was placed with his soldiers at the entrance gate of the castle hall. "Captain," said he, Go immediately with your company and disperse that assembly of factious men. They are no longer the representatives of the nation, but wretches who have caused all its misfortunes. Go in all haste and save my brother." Ponsard prepared to move and had scarcely put his soldiers in motion before he retraced his steps. General Bonaparte thought he hesitated. This was not the fact. Ponsard only wanted to know how he was to proceed in case of resistance. "Employ compulsory means," replied Bonaparte. "Even your bayonets." "That is enough, General," rejoined the captain, giving him the sword salute. He ordered his drummers to beat the charge, ascended the principal staircase of the castle in double quick time, and entered the hall with fixed bayonets. The scene changed in a moment. The tumult subsided, and the tribune was left empty. Those who some minutes before appeared the most resolute gave way to fear. They scaled the windows, leaped down into the gardens, and dispersed in all directions. General Bonaparte felt averse to employ force, but circumstances required it, and he had not adopted that course, he would have been lost, and Bernadotte would have prophesied rightly. Fouché had had an explanation on the subject with Renaud de Saint-Jean d'Angely, from whom I think I heard the particulars of the conversation. "Let not your general hesitate," said the minister. "It is better that he should bring matters to a point than allow the Jacobins time to rally. He is a lost man if a decree of accusation is carried against him. I answer to him for Paris. Let him make sure of St. Cloud." These sensible observations were in accordance with the language which this old stager of the Revolution had held during the preceding 6 weeks. Judging from the complexion of affairs that the Directory could not stand their ground, he took care not to oppose General Bonaparte's conspiracy. Ready to join it if it succeeded, he was likewise ready to denounce it in case of failure. He was waiting the result to come to a decision, as was afterwards acknowledged to me by Thoreau, then Chief Secretary of Police. "The result," said he, "fixed our determination as to the part we were to take. Had General Bonaparte failed, he and his party would have been brought to the scaffold. Measures were in fact so well taken, and Fouché was so well informed of what was going on at St. Cloud, that when an order was brought from the general to the different gates not to allow the fugitives to enter, every direction had already been given. The agents of police had already been 20 minutes on the watch. The minister had shown himself anxious to give to the prevailing party that proof of his attachment." Chapter 15. This bold measure, having dispersed the opposition, the deputies who were favorable to the growing revolution came to rally round the Council of Ancients. A decree immediately passed for the abolition of the Directory, the adjournment of both councils, the formation of a legislative commission composed of 50 members to be drawn in equal numbers from each council. The next object of attention was to organize the government. 3 magistrates were created who, under the name of consuls, were to exercise supreme power until a new constitution could be formed. General Bonaparte and the directors Sieyès and Roger-Ducos were elected consuls, all of whom took up their residence at the Palace of the Luxembourg, where the public impatience had there to restrain, whilst the issue of the enterprise was yet doubtful, now broke out in loud acclamations. A new era now opens for General Bonaparte. His reign dates from this time. "We have a master," said Sieyès, to whom the man he had deemed his superior only in military matters appeared for the first time in his real character, after he had heard him discuss in council the most intricate questions of government and of general administration. The new constitution was framed in the course of 6 weeks. The creation of the 3 consuls was confirmed, but a change took place in the individuals appointed to fill those elevated stations. General Bonaparte was named first consul, and Messieurs Commissaires and Lebrun second and third consuls in the room of Sieyès and Roger-Ducos, who became the principal members of the Conservative Senate, where they eventually sank into oblivion. A great part of all the good that was effected at this important epoch of our political regeneration must be ascribed to the 2 colleagues of General Bonaparte, the only one chosen from amongst the wisest and most enlightened magistrates, the other from the civil administrators who were the most esteemed for their probity and experience. To them belongs the merit of a proper selection of prefects, judges, and administrators, and of all those functionaries, in short, who so effectually seconded the efforts of the first consul to restore integrity to public affairs and equity to judicial decisions. The first 6 months of this new administration were productive of an improvement which an age of endeavors at another period would not have brought about. All parties were wearied of anarchy and disorder, and a state of things which promised quiet and security could not fail to receive the utmost support that everyone could bestow towards its consolidation. The internal administration began to run in a proper course, but, on the other hand, the War Department was in the most deplorable condition. The first consul bestowed his special attention to restoring the former pride of our standards. The confusion was such that the war minister was unable to furnish an exact statement of the army. He neither knew its strength, the number of corps composing it, nor the stations they respectively occupied. It was found necessary to dispatch officers in search of regiments and depots. They were directed to ascertain their numerical strength and immediately transmit that information to the war minister. The artillery was likewise in a most inefficient state, and the navy completely disorganized, though still possessing great and available resources. The finances were in so wretched a condition that on the night of the 18th Brumaire, the public chest did not contain wherewith to defray the charge of sending couriers to the army and principal cities that were to be made acquainted with the event. The first expenses incurred were paid out of funds lent to the public treasury under conditions which the urgency of the crisis rendered it compulsory to accede to. The diplomatic body consisted of an envoy from Charles IV, who only resided at Paris on account of the detention of the Spanish fleet at Brest, and of a charge d'affaires of the Prince of Dupont, lately become Elector of Bavaria. It should be added that the latter remained rather on the footing of a private individual than as an envoy vested with a diplomatic character. It required a man of the genius of the first consul not to shrink at so fearful an aspect of public affairs. This complication of difficulties, so far from discouraging him, only tended to inflame his resolution. He placed his glory upon conquering so many obstacles, and he succeeded in the attempt. The appointments which he made to the ministry were received with general approbation. In his first choice, he had the rare good fortune to fix upon men of mature experience, whose age and habits of business made them readier to the task and could not fail to command obedience. All were convinced of the necessity of extricating the nation from the embarrassment into which anarchy and corruption had plunged it. All placed their glory in seconding the intentions of the first consul, who soon discovered that he might rely upon them for bestowing the necessary attention to the respective departments. His military position became the subject of his meditations. He wanted men, clothing, and horses. Everything was supplied to him with generous profusion. An alteration was soon effected in the condition of the armies. When he took the helm of the state, large forces were employed to suppress the civil war, a fact which the Directory took care to conceal. He immediately sought the means of taking back to the frontiers an army which had become indispensable to make head against foreign enemies. A pacification did not appear to him impossible. The cruelties of which La Vendée had been the theater dated from the period of the committees. His administration had not yet dealt in acts of reprisal. The chiefs of the insurgents must necessarily be tired of a war without an object. He resolved to make overtures to them which, if unsuccessful, could not in any way compromise him. He therefore ordered the commander-in-chief of the Western Army to open a communication with those chiefs to propose their coming to Paris and judge for themselves of the sincerity of the motives which actuated him when he invited them to the capital. and he guaranteed their safe return home. Whatever might be their determination at the close of the conference, he was desirous of holding with them. They all complied with the invitation. The first consul made them no reproaches. He told them that if they had only taken up arms for their personal defense and that of the population of those provinces, they had no longer any motive for continuing the war. Government did not wish to molest any of them. They had henceforward the same claim to the protection of the laws as those against whom they had fought. If, on the contrary, they had taken up arms to revive the feudal yoke, they should consider that they formed the weakest part of the nation, that it was not probable that they could succeed, and that it was unjust in them to pretend to dictate laws to the majority. He added that the successes they had hitherto obtained were greatly owing to the external war in which the country was engaged. They would soon find what little advantage could be derived by them from their allies. As he was on the point of proceeding to place himself at the head of the troops, he pledged his word to afford them a proof of what he said. These considerations could not fail to make a due impression upon men who, for the most part, had taken arms merely to secure themselves from the vexatious proceedings of a jealous government. They asked one day to consider of the subject, and all, with the exception of George Cadoudal, declared that they would submit to a government under which their peace and quiet would not be disturbed. They even offered him the use of those means which they had hitherto employed to resist the anarchical system that was prevalent previously to his coming to power. They went freely through the streets of Paris, called to see their friends, and returned home to their provinces, where they faithfully kept their word. George Cadoudal presented himself with his colleagues at the audience of the first consul. The latter spoke to him of the glory he had acquired, the rank he had obtained amongst the notables of his province, and added that he should combine with the high feelings that had contributed to his elevation the feelings of a patriot who would no doubt be adverse to prolonging the misfortunes of the soil on which he was born. He stopped. George, instead of replying, muttered a few words that had more meaning than wit, constantly stood with downcast looks, and concluded by asking for his passport. The first consul not only had it delivered to him, but ordered him immediately out of Paris, an order which he complied with. The principal chiefs of La Vendée having made their submission, there remained nothing more than a plundering system of warfare, which was, however, carried to such an extent as to render the communications hazardous and at times to interrupt them altogether. Men to whom the Civil War had given a martial turn were averse to go back to their labor. They refused to yield to the invitations of their chiefs and continued their roving life. The excesses they were guilty of soon made them lose the little consideration they had obtained. They became a burden to provinces which only desired repose, and were accordingly pursued and delivered up to the tribunals, who made a severe example of such as fell into their power. Chapter 16. The first consul had succeeded in restoring peace in the interior. He had reestablished order in the administration, and subjected to the fiscal laws whole provinces, which, ever since the commencement of our civil dissensions, had ceased to pay taxes. A still more important result of this measure, considering the circumstances of the time, was his being able to dispose at once of 80,000 veteran soldiers, whom the Directory had kept stationary in La Vendée, to whose absence from active service was principally to be attributed to the ill success of our arms. According to the most correct estimates, that cruel intestine war was attended with the loss of upwards of 500,000 of human beings. All were Frenchmen, and whilst some were put to death in the name of a God of peace, and at the foot of his very altars, others were offered up in sacrifice to liberty. Who can tell where these sanguinary executions would have stopped had not the 18th Brumaire arrested their progress? Rejoined at having put an end to a war of extermination, of which it was impossible to foretell what might have been the consequence, the first consul marched his troops towards Dijon, where he had just ordered a camp to be formed. He had made an appeal to all military men who had been driven from their standards by the blunders of the Directory. Wonderful to relate, his name operated as a spell to bring them back. Not one remained behind except such as were from unavoidable causes prevented from obeying the call. The cavalry was in a most inefficient state. The greater part of the regiments were reduced to skeletons and dismounted. A requisition was made for horses at the rate of 1 in every 20, which was afterwards reduced to 1 in every 30. They were collected from all parts of France, furnished without murmur, and delivered into the depots on a stated day. The army was seen, as if by magic, to spring up into a new existence and present as fine an appearance as in the glorious days of our history. Such were the first results of the confidence reposed in General Bonaparte. He was indispensable to France, and France proved to him that she felt him to be so. These gigantic measures, accomplished in so short a time, excited the more surprised, as their course had almost been unperceived. Everything had been planned and meditated in secret. The execution of the design followed with the rapidity of thought. No one in France could imagine out of what elements the army that was assembling at Dijon was composed. It was believed to exist upon paper only, because the materials were nowhere to be seen. The Austrians, being masters of all Italy, had doubtless neglected no means by which they might be informed of what was going forward beyond the Alps, which they hoped to force as soon as they should have taken Genoa, to which city they were laying siege. But what was going on at Dijon was little known to them, as it was in Paris. The spies they kept up in that capital could have transmitted none but satisfactory reports, since they continued their operations before Genoa. They were not aware that La Vendée was pacified, nor that it could offer so many resources to the First Consul, because the Directory had been on their guard never to acknowledge that they found it necessary to employ such a numerous army for the purpose of repressing the disturbances. The First Consul did not allow the enemy time to become acquainted with the progress which he had made, or the plans which he meditated. As he directed everything in person, he knew the day on which the troops set in motion were to arrive at Dijon. He repaired unexpectedly to the spot, only stayed the time requisite to see that his orders had been carried into effect, to ascertain the numbers of his soldiers, to examine into everything with a minuteness of detail hitherto unknown, and send the army forward, whilst he completed during the march the organization that was still wanting to it. He advanced towards the Great St. Bernard by way of Geneva, where he received a visit from M. Necker, who immediately proceeded to communicate to him his own ideas of administration, of a constitution, etc. But the First Consul had already his hands full, added to which he did not relish the conversation of the financier. I have heard him say at a late period that it seemed to him like the dissertations of a man desirous of linking himself to his fortune, but that his opinion had long been fixed respecting that minister whose talents did not appear to him to accord with the celebrity which he had obtained. The fame, however, which he acquired has nothing surprising in it. He added, so limited was the practical knowledge in matters of finance and administration in the days of his power. The First Consul crossed the St. Bernard on a handsome mule belonging to a rich landed proprietor in the valley. He had for a guide a young athletic peasant whose communicative disposition he felt pleasure in encouraging. What wouldst thou require to be happy? He asked him, as they were reaching the top of the mountain. My fortune would be made, replied the unpretending countryman, if I were owner of the mule you are riding. The First Consul smiled, and when the campaign was over and he had returned to Paris, he ordered the purchase of the finest mule that could be found, added to it a house and a few acres of land, and desired that his guide might be put in possession of that little fortune. The worthy peasant, who had already forgotten his adventure, learned then for the first time the name of the person he had guided over the St. Bernard. The First Consul had taken the most minute precautions to maintain order amongst the several court during a march of so painful a nature as that which they were performing across the Alps, and to prevent the men of weak constitution from quitting the columns to which they belong, independently of what the soldier carried about his person, he had caused a large supply of provisions to be collected at the monastery on the summit of the great St. Bernard. Each soldier, on passing it, received from the religious community a large piece of bread, some cheese, and a tumbler of wine. The bread and cheese were ready cut. The wine was poured out according as the troops filed past the monastery. Never did greater regularity preside at a distribution. Each one appreciated the foresight of which he had been the object. Not a soldier left the ranks, not a straggler was to be seen. The first consul expressed his gratitude to the community and ordered 100,000 francs to be delivered to the monastery in remembrance of the service it had rendered him. It would require an abler pen than mine to record the courageous efforts made to transport over the Alps the artillery and ammunition that followed the army. It seemed as if the conquest of Italy was an object of personal interest to each soldier. All were ambitious of acting a conspicuous part in so noble an undertaking. So great was the ardor displayed that the first consul found on the following morning 50 pieces of cannon fixed to their carriages at the foot of the mountain, together with their caissons and the requisite ammunition, which had been brought over on the backs of mules. The horses were put to the gun carriages, all in readiness to proceed. He stopped to signify his satisfaction to the gunners and thank them for the zeal they had shown, and then granted them a reward of 1,200 francs. But the sacred fire of glory had inspired these gallant fellows. They declined the grant. "We have not worked for money," said they. "Do not force us to take any. We will afford you many opportunities of rewarding us for what we have done." The army, having descended from the St. Bernard, entered the valley of Ivry and arrived before the Fort de Bar. The road runs under the glacis. This defile is full of danger for an army and quite impracticable for artillery. The time was too valuable, on the other hand, to be lost before a wretched fort which had only a weak garrison, although it was commanded by an officer fully determined to do his duty. He felt all the importance of the post confided to him and would listen to no proposal. It became necessary to make the cavalry and infantry file off through bypass hardly accessible by goats. The gunners on their side found no other means of eluding the vigilance of the Austrians in placing straw around the wheels of their gun carriages and caissons, and thus rolling them along during the night until they reached the spot to which the horses had been led. Everything was managed in such perfect silence that the garrison heard no noise, though the passage was effected at pistol-shot distance from the covered way. All who were employed in this dangerous transport were fully sensible that silence and promptitude were equally necessary. Everything accordingly went on as well as could be desired. The Austrians were far from suspecting an invasion of Italy from this quarter, and had not therefore made any defensive preparations. Ivry was without a garrison, and that town, which might have arrested our progress for some days, opened its gates as soon as our advanced guard appeared before it. We made it our first stronghold. The first consul, who was in all the ardor of his opening career, anxiously urged the army forward. His mind embraced at one and the same time the various objects of securing advantageous positions, recovering at once the ascendancy he formerly held, and presenting himself in the commanding attitude which public opinion confers upon a theater where the fate of Italy was about to be decided. He accelerated his movements and entered Milan, whilst that city was yet in ignorance of his having left Dijon. The Italians, struck with amazement, could not believe that he was amongst them. This doubt was soon dispelled, and they were not long in declaring for us. The Austrian line of operations was intercepted. No time was lost in stopping the post, containing amongst the correspondence a variety of information of the highest importance. Having seized the letters coming from Vienna to the Austrian army and those on their way from the army to Vienna, the first consul ascertained the very night of his arrival the extent of the reinforcements on their way to Italy, and the exact state of the army besieging Genoa, and of its park of artillery and hospitals. The war minister of the Emperor of Austria could not have furnished a statement more complete than what the first consul had become possessed of. He had in a few hours acquired a knowledge of everything he was desirous of learning respecting the actual positions of the Austrians in Italy. Other secrets were revealed to him by a correspondence which came from Genoa. He saw that the town still held out, but that it was in the utmost distress. A fresh occurrence completed the information he stood in need of previously to embarking upon the ulterior undertakings. A courier was stopped on his way with dispatches from Vienna to the Baron de Milla, who held the chief command of the Austrian army in Italy. What was still obscure in the political horizon was cleared up by these dispatches. Strange indeed was the position of General Bonaparte perusing at Milan the dispatches written by the Austrian government to the commander of its army and the reports of the latter to his government. The first consul was considering what part he should act when another courier sent by Monsieur de Milas to Vienna was brought to him. He ascertained from his dispatches that Genoa was on the point of falling. It still resisted indeed, but was expected very shortly to surrender. The courier was also the bearer of an account of the state of the army and had orders for the depots, the field equipages, and the parks of artillery in the rear. Information was so opportunely afforded, was not thrown away, and troops were sent to take possession of all the material which was now discovered to be so near at hand. The first consul had just ordered the castle of Milan to be invested. He had detached 2 bodies of troops, the one upon Brescia, the other upon the citadel of Turin. He marched upon Pavia, to which he removed his headquarters. The pontoon trade was seized in this place and joined to the trading boats. It afforded the means of crossing the Po. He detached troops towards Parma and Placentia and advanced in person with those that were to cross at Pavia. The passage was effected by General Lannes at the head of the 6th Light Infantry, who concealed themselves amongst the bushes on the opposite bank, and the bridge was soon formed, with all the activity displayed by Frenchmen in carrying forward any measure calculated to promote their success. The bridge was soon completed. The first consul made the army instantly cross over to the other side and took the road from Stradella to Montebello, along with his troops that were advancing. Fortune again supplied him on this march with fresh information respecting the enemy's position. An Austrian officer bearing a flag of truce was brought to him at his advanced post. He was escorted by an officer of Massena's staff, charged to transmit to him the terms of the capitulation of Genoa. This officer informed him how great was the delusion still entertained by the Austrians respecting his march and the forces under his orders. They had taken possession of Genoa with great pomp, and according to the forms of the most rigid etiquette, General Melas was indeed aware that the French had entered Italy by Ivry, but he refused to believe the reports of their numbers, and had merely sent a strong detachment to watch the banks of the river. Having left Genoa after that corps of troops, the officer had overtaken it and succeeded in estimating its strength, which he stated to General Bonaparte, as well as the distance at which he had parted from it. He also informed the first consul that the Austrian army had pushed no detachment upon Parma and Placentia. Those which we had sent in that direction became accordingly useless and were recalled, but without waiting their return. The army marched to meet the Austrians. The action took place at Montebello. It was extremely brilliant, and at a later period, General Lannes, who became a Marshal of France, received his title from it as Duc de Montebello.